Now is the time, Elder Scout.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
Science describes the least of things. Religion, magic, bows to the endless in everything. The mystery.
I saw a means to realize my potential, to transcend my human form.
Emotions can make it speed up or slow down. We are all time travelers if you think about it.
Absolutely not. Good conspiracy is an unprovable one. If you can prove it, they must have screwed up somewhere along the line.
You gotta turn off your mind and relax, and then just float downstream.
Welcome to Truth and Shadow, your guide through the supernatural. I am your host, BT, and this is a Shadow Short. Let's navigate the unknown on this brief journey into the depths of mystery. When Stranger Things first appeared, it was widely received as a love letter to the 1980s. The era of bicycles, analog technology, Sony Walkmans, Cold War paranoia, and small-town America. Yet what lingered in the cultural imagination was not nostalgia alone, but some kind of deeper unease. The series felt less like fiction and more like déjà vu, as though it were drawing from a shared memory rather than inventing a story outright. And the power lies not merely in the monsters or in the suspense, but its central premise, that there are doors in reality which human beings were never meant to open. At its core, Stranger Things is a narrative about experimentation on the human mind, about trauma-induced thresholds, and about what happens when institutions decide that curiosity and power justify any cost. The supernatural elements serve as metaphors, but metaphors rooted in a long and unsettling history. Long before Hollywood imagined government labs and psychic children, real individuals, organizations, and ideologies were already attempting to map, manipulate, and weaponize consciousness itself. To understand why Stranger Things resonates so strongly, one must follow the thread backward through 20th century occultism, Cold War intelligence programs, countercultural collapse, and ultimately into the reoccurring human fascination with forces that appear to operate beyond moral constraint. The modern chapter of this story begins with ritualized science. Aleister Crowley occupies a critical place in the genealogy of ideas that treat the human mind as an instrument rather than an individual. Crowley did not merely dabble in symbolism or spiritual metaphor. He pursued occult practice with a technology of transformation. His writings describe consciousness as something that could be systematically altered through the will, through discipline and extreme experience. Crowley believed that ritual, sexual energy, exhaustion, and altered states of consciousness could pierce the veil between worlds, maybe more precisely between modes of reality. He spoke openly of contact with non-human intelligences, presenting these encounters not as some kind of religious experience, but as some kind of answer to experiment. Whether one accepts Crowley's interpretations or not, that's beside the point. What matters is that he helped normalize an idea that would later migrate from occult lodges into secular institutions, that the human psyche could be broken down, reconstructed, and potentially used as a gateway to hidden dimensions of perception. Crowley's influence did not merely manifest through direct lineage to intelligence agencies, but also through a shared philosophical assumption that consciousness is malleable and that ethical boundaries are secondary to progress, to discovery. This assumption would prove catastrophic once adopted by organizations with nearly limitless resources, obscene amounts of authority, and geopolitical pressure. By the mid-20th century, the locus of this curiosity shifted decisively into the realm of state power. The Cold War created a climate in which fear of unseen threats justified unprecedented experimentation. The enemy was not merely another nation, but an invisible force capable of infiltrating minds, loyalties, and identity. Within this context, the United States military and its intelligence apparatus began exploring psychological warfare with increasing intensity. One of the most overlooked yet revealing sites in this history is Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, a top-secret facility located in Laurel Canyon. Lookout Mountain was officially a film production and analysis center for the military. It was responsible for documented nuclear tests and creating classified footage thereof. In practice, it was also deeply involved in psychological warfare research, producing materials intended to shape perception, morale, and emotional response. The placement of such a facility in Laurel Canyon, the very area that would soon become synonymous with countercultural experimentation, music, and social upheaval, well, that raises troubling questions. Psychological operations are rarely confined to laboratories. They are tested in environments where human behavior can be directly observed, influenced, and measured. While definitive evidence linking Lookout Mountain to cultural engineering remains elusive, the convergence of military psychological research and the sudden emergence of a fractured, drug-saturated counterculture in the same geographic space, well, that's difficult to ignore. It was during this same time period that the United States intelligence community formally embraced the idea that the mind could be a battlefield. Psionic research, once dismissed as fringe science, gained renewed attention. Remote viewing, extrasensory perception, and altered states of consciousness were no longer merely spiritual curiosities. They were potential strategic assets. This line of inquiry culminated in the now infamous MK-Ultra, a quote-unquote umbrella designation for a series of experiments that sought to understand and control human cognition through extreme methods. The historical record confirms that MK-Ultra employed LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and various forms of psychological stress, often without informed consent. Many subjects experienced profound trauma, memory fragmentation, and identity disruption. The destruction of a significant portion of MK-Ultra's documentation ensures that the full scope of these experiments will never be known. What is known, however, is that trauma proved to be a powerful tool. Turns out trauma fractures the self. It will dissolve the coherent narrative that binds identity together. In such a fractured state, individuals become highly suggestible, receptive to external influence, and eventually dissociate from moral anchors. This is where Stranger Things transitions from allegory to reflection. The character of Eleven is not a fantastical invention, but a synthesis of documented psychological phenomena. She represents the child whose mind has been forcibly opened, whose trauma becomes the mechanism by which extraordinary perception is assessed. The series accurately portrays the cost of such access, emotional instability, identity loss, and vulnerability to invasion by something beyond the self. In this sense, the monsters of Stranger Things are less important than the method by which they enter the world. It's not a portal, but it's the wounded human being. The human consequences of these experiments were not confined to laboratories. They spilled into society, sometimes in spectacularly violent ways. Few figures embody this collapse more clearly than Charles Manson. Manson's life was marked by institutionalism, incarceration, and exposure to experimental rehabilitation techniques. He emerged not as a master strategist, but as a psychological void, an individual whose identity had been so eroded that it could be filled with apocalyptic narratives, symbolic systems, and external voices. Manson's followers did not submit to him through any kind of rational persuasion. They dissolved into him through a process of identity surrender. This phenomena aligns with what psychologists observe in highly traumatized individuals, ritual abuse victims. It's a longing for meaning, for structure, and for belonging that all overrides any kind of moral judgment. With Manson, his rhetoric borrowed heavily from popular music, biblical imagery, and from racial mythology to blend them into a single apocalyptic worldview. He didn't invent it. He absorbed it, transmitted it, and in this sense, Manson functioned less as an originator. Manson functioned less as an originator than a receiver, a conduit through which destructive archetypes found expression. The notion of archetypal forces operating through human hosts is ancient. Across cultures, stories warn of intelligences that do not create but inhabit, that do not persuade but consume. And in modern fiction, these forces appear as the mind flayer, as the demigorgon, entities defined not by personality but by their function. They spread, they dominate, they assimilate. Their power lies in their indifference to individual suffering. This indifference is what makes them terrifying, and it is what aligns them disturbingly with real-world problems of human collapse. The line between metaphor and manifestation becomes especially thin in cases where individuals explicitly identify with such sinister forces. One of the most chilling examples is Pazuzu Algarad, a man who legally adopted the name of an ancient Mesopotamian demon. Algarad's life and crimes were characterized by ritual behavior, symbolic degradation, and a profound rejection of human moral boundaries. While mental illness undoubtedly played a role, it does not fully explain the deliberate adoption of a demonic identity. Mental illness distorts perception. It does not typically construct coherent mythologies. Algarad's actions suggest not something that can't be called confusion, but more like a surrender, like he stepped aside from the self in favor of something darker and more consuming to take its place, to take his place. This raises a question that modern society is deeply uncomfortable asking. What if some ideas behave less like abstractions and more like infections? What if certain symbolic systems, once internalized, exert agency over those who adopt them? The language of possession may feel archaic, yet the behavior it describes persists. Individuals lose autonomy, communities begin to fracture, and violence becomes sacred rather than incidental. These patterns repeat regardless of cultural context, suggesting they arise from something more fundamental than social conditioning alone. And I believe Stranger Things captures this reality with unsettling precision. The mind flayer does not negotiate or reason. It infiltrates, it dominates, and it uses fear and trauma as entry points. And it spreads through a network of wounded individuals. This portrayal seems to align closely with both ancient demonological descriptions and modern psychological models of dissociation. The series' genius lies in its refusal to reduce the threat to a single villain. Instead, it presents evil as systemic, parasitic, opportunistic, thrives wherever boundaries collapse. And when viewed through this lens, the 20th century appears less as an age of progress and more as a prolonged experiment in boundary violation. Crowley sought transcendence without moral constraint. Intelligence agencies pursued control without ethical restraint. Countercultural movements explored liberation without discernment. In each case, the result was not enlightenment, but fragmentation. It was as if doors were open in the human psyche that could not be easily closed, and whatever entered through those doors was rarely benevolent. The true horror of Stranger Things is not the existence of the upside down, but the implication that the boundary between worlds is maintained not by technology, but by some kind of integrity. When that integrity is shattered through the trauma, through obsession, hubris, the barrier falls. The series suggests that the greatest danger lies not in the unknown itself, but in humanity's willingness to sacrifice its most vulnerable members in pursuit of knowledge and power. This is not merely a critique of past mistakes. It's more like a warning. Modern neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and transhumanist philosophies continue to explore the limits of consciousness with little consensus on ethical restraint. The language has changed, but the impulse remains the same. Curiosity promises transcendence while wisdom urges caution. History suggests that ignoring the latter invites consequences that cannot be controlled. And so, it seems like this reoccurring appearance of these stories, whether in fiction, crime, or cultural memory, may not be coincidence. They may represent a collective attempt to process a truth we have not fully acknowledged. That the human mind is not an empty vessel, and that not every door should be opened. Some thresholds exist for protection, not limitation. When those thresholds are violated, the result is not liberation, but loss. I keep coming back to the same unease, the same questions that never quite resolve, no matter how many. I keep coming back to the same unease, the same question that never quite resolves, no matter how many testimonies I read, or how many patterns I trace across history. It's the realization that the most dangerous moments never announce themselves as evil. They arrive dressed as curiosity, as progress, as the noble pursuit of knowledge. We don't step across the line because we want destruction. We step across it because we believe we're ready, because we've convinced ourselves that intention is enough to protect us from consequences. What troubles me most about all of this, from Crowley to MK Ultra and from Laurel Canyon to the children in Hawkins, it's not that human beings reach too far. It's that we never stop to ask what it means to reach out at all. We assume consciousness was empty space, neutral ground, a thing to be mapped and occupied. But nothing in the human experience supports that assumption. The mind is not a vacuum. It is already inhabited by memory, by conscience, by meaning, by something that resists being reduced to circuitry or chemistry. When we shattered that interior structure through trauma or obsession, we didn't create freedom. We created a vacancy, and a vacancy never stays empty. I've been looking at all these extraordinary things for a long time. I might even be convinced that truth is always just hidden behind the next locked door. But the longer I do this, the more I suspect the real mystery isn't what's out there. It's why we keep ignoring what's already been written into us. Every culture, every religion, every myth, worth remembering, warns about the same thing. Knowledge without wisdom corrodes the soul. Power without restraint doesn't elevate, it consumes. We keep telling ourselves that ancient warnings don't apply to us anymore because we're enlightened. We have better tools, better language, better science. When I look at figures like Manson or Pazuzu Algarad, I don't just see madness. I see fragmentation. I see what happens when identity dissolves into something colder Evil doesn't always need to invent new desires. Sometimes it just offers structure to the broken, a voice to the lonely, purpose to the fragmented. And once that exchange happens, morality becomes negotiable. Violence becomes symbolic. The self becomes expendable. Stranger Things understands this in a way that feels almost accidental, as if the story itself is remembering something we'd rather forget. The monsters, they aren't scary because they're powerful. They're scary because they don't care. They don't hate us. They simply use what's there, trauma. Maybe the real work in front of us isn't discovering what lies beyond the veil. Maybe it's learning how to restore the boundaries we've dismantled, to remember that some limits exist not to imprison us, but to keep us whole. Because once we open the door, the hardest thing is remembering how to close it. And harder still is choosing to do so.
I can't slow it down. Feels like Hawkins calling from another time. Lights flicker, signals in the air.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain. But you feel.
Demons in the shadows, whispering my name. Reality's a war I can't tame. Walkie-talkies calling, are you still alive? In this broken world, we just survive.
My fears watching me, heart beat slow. The levels power rise and energy flow. Friends don't lie, that's the code we know. In the deepest night, our courage glows. Bikes on the road, lightning in the sky. Running from the dark, but we still don't die. Upside down. Silence screams and fear gets loud. If you're lost, I'll find you now. Even if the world gets turned around from there to the upside down.
What is real? How do you define real? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
Hold my hand, we'll leave this town till the gates are closed.
The truth. Nothing more.